The bottom portion of that vertical line is the vomer, an individual bone. We already mentioned it. The top part of that vertical line is the perpendicular plate, which is a downward extension of the ethmoid bone. Also coming from the ethmoid bone, inside the nose, the top two little curlicues that you can see located on the sides of the nose here are the middle nasal concha. The superior nasal concha are part of the ethmoid bone but not visible on these skulls. If we go to the bottom of the nose holes, we can see the inferior nasal concha. They are a separate bone, not part of the ethmoid bone. And finally, the maxilla also has alveoli, which would be those sockets where the teeth would sit. Okay, we're going to go from the face now to look at the side of the skull and say what features can we see on the side of the skull. Well, you'll recall the zygomatic bone, which was the bone forming the cheekbone of the face. The zygomatic bone extends back, and this little extension going backwards is called the temporal process. Now, the temporal process meets an extension of our temporal bone called the zygomatic process. And collectively, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone form the zygomatic arch, this rim of bone going from your cheek to back by your ear. We get back to the ear, and we can see a large conspicuous hole. This is the external acoustic meatus. You may also see it as external auditory meatus. So that'll be the ear hole we can see. Just below the ear hole, we see a very large conspicuous projection of bone, which is the mastoid process. And just in front of the mastoid process, we see a much smaller, more subtle extension of bone, which is the styloid process. We're going to return to those when we go to look at the bottom of the skull view. Rotating to the back of the skull, you'll recall the occipital bone formed the back of the skull, and this large bony bump that we can see on the back of the skull is called the external occipital protuberance. And it's that large projection. You can feel it on your own skull if you feel the back of your own skull. Rotating to the bottom of the skull, we can now see a large number of features. They get a little bit small. Is your zoom still okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're on the bottom of the skull. Beginning at the top, we can now see the bottom of the maxilla bone. So we can see the bottom of the maxilla bone. It's forming the front of the roof of your mouth. If we look right behind the front two teeth, you can see a small little divot right behind the front two teeth, and that's called the incisive fossa. If we follow this roof of the maxilla down here, and this portion of the maxilla is called the palatine process, we eventually get to a separate bone back here called the palatine bone. And on this flat angle that I'm showing you, you can see the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. Collectively, the palatine process of the maxilla and the horizontal plate of the palatine bone form the hard palate, which is part of the roof of your mouth. Now there's another part of the palatine bone, which if I rotate it forward, I've hopefully got a nice angle that you're essentially looking through the nose holes. You can see two holes going through here. The middle wall is formed by the vomer and the perpendicular plate. The walls on either side as you look through the nose holes are formed by the vertical plates of the palatine bones. So you can see two openings through the nose holes. The sides are the vertical plates. The middle is largely the perpendicular plate. Going back to our skull, we look and we can see sort of a midline of skull running through here, and we can see a variety of holes. On either side here, we can see the foramen lacerum. If you go just outside of the foramen lacerum, the next holes over are the foramen ovale. They're a little more conspicuous on the inside of the skull, so we'll return to them when we do the inside of the skull. Working backwards a little bit, you'll see the very large foramen magnum, the hole through which the spinal cord emanates from the skull. On either side of the foramen magnum, you'll see these kidney bean-shaped holes. They kind of look like a double hole that's been fused together, and those are your jugular foramen. And if you go just in front of the jugular foramen, you can see holes which are the carotid canals. So you have your foramen magnum, on either side, your jugular foramen, which look kind of like kidney beans, and just above those, the carotid canals. You'll recall the heavy mastoid process, which we saw on the outside of the skull, and the styloid process, which we saw from the side of the skull. Between those, there's a very small hole called the stylomastoid foramen, so named because it's sitting between those other conspicuous features. I think from here we're going to turn to the inside of the skull. So we'll now take the lid off the skull, and we're going to go back to the inside of the skull and say what features can we see in here. We'll start off with the anterior cranial fossa, and right in the middle of the anterior cranial fossa is the ethmoid bone. It's conspicuous, you can feel it because there's a ridge that sticks up in the ethmoid bone. The ridge that sticks up is called the crista galli, that portion of the ethmoid bone. On either side of the crista galli, we see a surface of bone with a number of small holes, like someone has stippled it, and that surface of bone with small holes is the cribriform plate. The holes themselves are called the olfactory foramina. Moving back, we can now see some features of the sphenoid bone. Up here, at the very back of the anterior cranial fossa, we see the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. If we jump down, we now can see the greater wing of the sphenoid bone in the middle cranial fossa. In the middle of the sphenoid bone is this little feature, which I often call the handle, because you can pick up the skull by it. The handle region is more accurately called the sella turcica, the resting point of your pituitary gland. What holes can we see while we're inside the skull? Well, if we look on either side of the sella turcica, we can again see the foramen lacerum, which we also saw on the bottom of the skull. If you work your way out from the foramen lacerum, you'll see a large hole on either side, which are the foramen ovale. Just behind the foramen ovale are the foramen spinosum, and in front of the foramen ovale, you sometimes have to turn it a little bit so you can get the correct angle here, we find the foramen rotundum. Working our way back into the posterior cranial fossa, we can again see our foramen magnum, the very large conspicuous hole. Working your way up from the foramen magnum, you're going to encounter three holes. The bottom of these holes is the hypoglossal canal. You'll next see again that kidney bean-shaped hole, which is the jugular foramen. And if you keep going up, following that line, you'll find the internal acoustic meatus or internal auditory meatus inside the skull. And I believe that covers most of the features that you're responsible for on the inside of the skull. A last thing to do is going to be the holes that we encounter within the orbits or eye holes. If you get the right angle on the orbit or eye holes, you'll see the superior orbital fissures, which have a down and in angle. You'll see the inferior orbital fissures, which have a down and out angle. And in the medial corner, sort of where those two structures point, you'll find the optic canal or optic foramen, the hole for the optic nerves to emanate through. So that walks us through the features of the skull. We now need to carry on to talk about the vertebrae.
Wait, can I stop it and then?
Sure.